Thanks for staying with us. Time now for Africa News with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the judge presiding over the murder trial of South African track star Oscar Pistorius hears the first eyewitness account of the last moments of Reeva Steenkamp's life. Also, former Rwandan army boss Faustin Nyamwasa tells France 24 that he believes he's once again been the target of a hit squad sent by Kigali. And aid workers struggling to help the thousands of Central African refugees who fled to Chad warned that returning expats of Chadian origin are being abandoned to their fate. First up, for the first time in the murder trial of South African Olympian Oscar Pistorius, the courts heard an eyewitness account of what happened at his home last Valentine's Day. Harrowing evidence laid out attempts to save the life of Reeva Steenkamp. Pistorius says he fatally shot his girlfriend by accident and today broke down as details of her last moments were described.
He said, "I shot her. I thought she was a burglar and I shot her."
The testimony of a local doctor who arrived on the scene after hearing shots was too much to bear. Oscar Pistorius broke down with his head in his hands.
All during that time, there wasn't any signs of life that I could see.
As the doctor described the injuries sustained by Reeva Steenkamp in grisly detail, the star Olympian covered his ears. The double amputee runner says he accidentally shot the former model on the night of Valentine's Day 2013 after mistaking her for an intruder. Prosecutors are out to prove premeditation and are expected to use witness testimony to show that the couple had a heated argument on the night of the shooting. State witness Pistorius' neighbour described how she was woken by blood-curdling screams and then shots.
The time between the first and the fourth shot was much longer than between the second and the third one.
The woman's account was corroborated by her husband, but the defence argued that it would have been impossible to hear the screams given the distance, and in cross-examination accused the witnesses of a conspiracy against Pistorius, an accusation the couple denied.
It's designed to try and again sideline and incriminate.
On Monday, Pistorius faced the court and pled not guilty to murder over a year after admitting to killing his then-girlfriend.
How do you plead?
Not guilty, my lady.
If found guilty of premeditated murder, the man known as Blade Runner could face 25 years or more behind bars.
Libya's preparing to prosecute the second son of the country's former strongman Muammar Gaddafi after he was extradited back from Niger. Fireworks were let off in Tripoli upon news that al-Sadi had been returned. He faces accusations of human rights abuses during the 2011 uprising against his father.
Members of a Libyan militia made up of former rebels, the Tripoli Revolutionaries Brigade, celebrated the decision by Niger to turn over Sadi Gaddafi, a son of the late dictator Muammar Gaddafi, to Libyan authorities. He is seen here in jail in Tripoli, kneeling on a mattress while one of his jailers shaves his head and beard. Libya had repeatedly called for his extradition from Niger, which had granted him asylum since 2011 on humanitarian grounds, saying it did not believe he would get a fair trial in Libya. Several human rights organizations denounced the decision to hand him over.
Niger
and Cameroon are parties to the Geneva Convention, so we would have preferred for the authorities in Niger to communicate this to us directly, and not in the way we have learnt about it via international media. We are outraged.
40-year-old Sadi Gaddafi fled across the Sahara Desert to Niger during the 2011 uprising that saw rebels capture and kill his father, ending his 4-decade dictatorship. His 3 brothers were killed during the uprising. Sadi was best known as the head of Libya's Football Federation. Interpol accuses him of misappropriating properties through force and armed intimidation during that time. The Justice Minister in Niger refused to comment on Sadi Gaddafi's extradition to Libya. Around 30 senior Gaddafi regime officials are believed to have entered Niger at the same time as Sadi. But the authorities in Niamey have not said how many remain in the country.
Rwanda's government once again been accused of trying to assassinate an exiled dissident. Former army chief Faustin Nyamwasa says that a group of armed men stormed his Johannesburg home this week. Luckily, he wasn't in, but he told us he believes the gang was sent by President Paul Kagame.
Kayumba Nyamwasa has no doubts. He says the armed men who stormed his house this week worked for the Rwandan government. He told us they want to kill him because he's an outspoken critic of the President Paul Kagame.
We criticize President Kagame for rigging and stealing elections. We accuse him of corruption. We accuse him of denying the people of Rwanda liberty and freedom, and by denying people the freedom to express themselves. Is that the reason why we should be killed? We may not be his friends, but we are not the enemies of the country.
4 years ago in Johannesburg, Nyamwasa was shot in the stomach. He used to be one of Kagame's closest allies and commanded the Rwandan army for many years. But he fell out with him 4 years ago and is now a member of the RNC opposition party. The Rwandan authorities accuse him of being linked to the FDLR Hutu rebels.
The criminal activities of Kayumba and his group and the RNC, they are linked with FDLR and the terrible activities that they have been committing among Rwandans.
Earlier this year, in this Johannesburg hotel, it was Rwanda's former intelligence chief, Patrick Karegeya, who was found strangled to death. Paul Kagame denied any involvement in the murder of this opposition leader, but said treason brought consequences.
Central African Republic's foreign minister told the UN Security Council today that the need for a peacekeeping force in his country is more urgent than ever. French and African troops on the ground are struggling to contain escalating violence, and the UN Security Council met today to consider a recommendation from its Secretary-General to send in a 12,000-member UN mission. Well, France 24's Jessica Mazurier is in New York. She joins us now. Jess, there was some pretty moving testimony at that meeting today.
Indeed, Georgia, UN officials painted a really tragic picture of what's going on right now in the Central African Republic. The humanitarian affairs chief, Valerie Amos, who returned just a short while ago from the CAR, described the situation there, saying that 650,000 people are displaced and they are living in atrocious conditions, that the rainy season is looming, as well as a food crisis. She said that when she spoke to the interim president, Catherine Samba-Panza, she said that when she meets people in the streets of Bangui, the first thing that Central Africans do is point to their stomachs because they are starving. And she said that if she doesn't get much needed funding in order to be able to feed her people soon, then they're going to lose trust in her. Now, the High Commissioner for Refugees also said that after his visit, that it was the crisis that has caused him the most anguish in the 8 years that he's been in his current position. He said that the crisis there is not, as it has been portrayed, really a religious one, that it is actually a power struggle, and that that's what's really caused this crisis in the Central African Republic. Now, last but not least, Central African Republic Interim Minister Toussaint Congo Doudou made a very emotional plea. He broke from speaking in French to make a very personal plea, softly spoken in English, saying, please, please help us before it's too late, for the sake of the kids of the Central African Republic, the girls who are being raped and the people who are being killed.
Just very quickly, any details there on how the UN plans to move forward with a mission if or when it's approved?
Well, Ban Ki-moon's report that was presented to the Security Council today calls for a full-blown UN peacekeeping mission. We'll probably see a resolution by the end of the month. That will be voted on, and then 6 months from then, which will be about September, we will see the MISCA and Sangari's forces probably rehatted, transformed into a UN peacekeeping mission.
Thanks very much. Jessica Mazurier there for us in New York. Well, the Central African crisis was sparked by a rebel takeover last year. Christian militia formed to fight back against the Seleka insurgents, then turned on communities they accused of backing the rebels. The bloodshed seen around 70,000 Muslims evacuated into neighbouring Chad. Well, aid workers are flagging up the difficulties faced by the thousands now struggling to get the help afforded to refugees because they are of Chadian origin. Well, Ondine Ripka from Doctors Without Borders joins us now for more on this. Ondine, thanks very much for coming in. Now, you've spent time in those camps, and it really seems that the Chadian government's struggling to work out what to do with returning expats who have spent most of their life in Central African Republic.
Well, actually, most of the people we see in the field, I've just spent 2 weeks on the border between Chad and Central African Republic, are Central Africans. A part of those evacuated, of course, were either Chadian or of Chadian origin, but most of the people we see there are Central Africans, and actually many of them have documents from Central Africa.
So what are the conditions that people are challenged with when they head over to Chad, fleeing the violence that they've been facing in Central African Republic?
Well, apart from security, I would say that the situation today is really alarming. First of all, people are hungry. There's no other words. There is no food. I was in Sido, which is a town where 40,000 people transited, fleeing from Central Africa into Chad. 13,000 people are living there. You have to imagine what the situation is. Families living under trees, competing for the shade of a tree, women who have taken off their Muslim veils to protect their children from the sun. Currently, they are absolutely with nothing and have nothing to eat. I was interviewing a mother who was forced to share the nutritional treatment which was given to her to treat her severely malnourished children to feed the rest of the family. This is not acceptable. Furthermore, the shelter is a huge problem. People, as I say, was just sleeping on the floor, and it has just started to rain. I let you imagine what it is in the morning, having spent the entire night under the rain, families, children, old people. The situation is really critical.
And across the board, aid agencies are really struggling to attract enough funding to be able to tackle these challenges.
Well, I mean, there's, apart from the Chadian government, who has deployed significant efforts to evacuate these people and save them from the atrocities, this situation is even worse when you think about what these people have gone through. Extreme violence, people telling us how entire families have been killed with machetes, fleeing in a very poor condition, numerous attacks. For example, a mother was telling us how they were not able to take the child which was handed over to her when the truck left. Therefore, today, it's really important that both aid workers, but also the United Nations and the Chadian governments take into account this situation.
Thanks very much. Ondine Ripka there, joining us from Doctors Without Borders and some of the challenges faced by fleeing Muslims from Central African Republic. Well, we're going to leave the bulletin there. Stay with us, though. Short break and more news and headlines are coming up.